Hello, everyone. It is Irene here. Welcome to this Q&A Facebook Live today. I'm just getting set up here, making sure I can see everything. If you're watching this on the replay, which you probably are, thank you for being here. Thanks for pressing play and going back after the fact. If you're watching this on my YouTube channel, hello to YouTube. Thank you for continuing to show up and watch these longer form Q&As. My name is Irene Lyon, and I'm going to answer some questions and dive into some topics around the nervous system, healing trauma, emotions, our survival responses, resiliency, regulation. We've got one today on neuroplasticity and epigenetics. So thank you for being here. And it looks like we have got a good signal. So good morning, good afternoon, hello, hello. And what I wanted to do before I get started, I'm going to have a little water here, is talk quickly about a few things, about emotions and about this work in general, and then I'll dive into the questions. And if you're following me on my email list, you may have seen, and by the way, if you're not on my email list, please get on that list, mainly because each Monday we send out a fresh email with a new piece of content. It's typically a video with a bit of an article that goes with it, all the offerings that I have going on during the week, whether it's one of these calls, whether it's one of my drop-in classes. We have another one coming up, not this Saturday, but the following Saturday. I think it's May 16th. We do only one a month. So if you haven't yet checked out a drop-in class, be sure to do so. But email is my preferred way of communicating. I know I show up a lot on social media, whether here, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook here. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. It's kind of crazy. But these methods aren't always foolproof. And if you're not looking at the right time, on your feet at the right time, you might miss something. And so at least with email, once a week, you'll get a note from me with, again, new video, bit of an article, some of my musings, online stuff when I'm teaching, when I'm working live, etc. Of course, right now, with our current strangeness in the world, two of my most recent upcoming workshops have been canceled, sadly. If you don't know, I do teach in person something called Up and Down. It's the Up and Down Movement Workshop for Nervous System Regulation. I co-teach that with my dear friend and colleague and faculty within my business. His name is Elia Marak. We can post that link down below. But our Vancouver, and I'm just saying this so everyone's aware, our Vancouver workshop that was set to run in June and our Montreal workshop, which is the East Coast of Canada, I'm on the West Coast, which was set to run in August. We have had to cancel those, unfortunately, just because of uncertainty. I think things will be opened up by then, but we just didn't want to risk it. So please know that those two have been canceled, but we still have Sweden, Stockholm, Sweden, later September, and then London, UK, very late September and into early October. Cross fingers that we'll be able to run those. We were in Sweden last year, and we were in the UK, and it was awesome to be there and teach and meet those of you across the Atlantic pond. So I wanted to just give you a little update there. As I said, if you're not following me on email, you might not know these things. So that's one piece of housekeeping. The other piece of housekeeping is that in the coming weeks and months, we're going to be making it a little easier and a bit more streamlined for you to ask me questions via my Healthy Nervous System Revolution Facebook group. Some of you have found me through that group. Some of you found that group through my programs. Either way, if you're not following that group, you're not part of that group, be sure to head over there. And my assistant, Crystal, who's here live, popping up links, she's my secret person in the background. She's popping up links. She'll pop the link to that group if you're not part of that group. But we're going to make that group a little easier for people to navigate so my team can go in and answer questions on a regular basis, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. First thing I wanted to talk about, and I'm just seeing who's here. Hello to France and Deb and Misha and Elizabeth and let's see if I can pronounce this, Gerte, Naomi, hello from Mississauga, Rise. Thanks to all of you for being here. We've got about 52, looks like 52 people here. And I had a bit of a break last week. We're in our version of reading week in my program, Smart Body, Smart Mind. This is a program we run once a year. We're in the last month of the program, so we're going to run again next year. And I wanted to mention the work I do. And I will get into the questions, but the reason I want to mention the work, and the work that is in addition to these live streams and the education, is that I am a full-fledged practitioner, trauma trained, working with the nervous system. I used to be in private practice. As I said, I teach workshops, and most, if not all of the questions, but one today, all relate to me having to say the next step in the journey, if you wish to dive in more, is to do one of my online programs. Or if you're not feeling drawn to doing an online program, seek out a somatic practitioner who is trained at a very high level. Now, there's a caveat to that. There are not many of us on this beautiful Earth planet that are trained at the level that I am at and my colleagues. I am into my mid-40s and I've been doing this work since 1997, which is a few years. And therefore, it takes time for people to learn how to work at this level in a real solid way. So I want to give you some options at the beginning, and then we'll get into the questions, and then I'll get back to some things around emotions. Might do emotions first. But the programs I run get you into the practice. It's education and theory, mostly theory, but the education has to be there. And it's education that is deeper than what we get into here. Ethically, it has to be done in a program setting where we have a different kind of agreement going on. So just want to make sure that everyone knows about these things that I do online that aren't this. One of them is the 21-day nervous system tune-up. We'll pop that up so you can check that out. If you've been doing the 21-day tune-up, let me know if you're here. If you are a Smart Body, Smart Mind member, the course we're in now, let me know. But it comes down to doing this work and practicing self-study, more than reading and watching videos, but doing the actual physical practices of working with the nervous system at these deep neuroplastic levels. I talk about the importance in my work of sequencing neuroplastic healing, and we'll get into that a bit today. If we don't learn what this is and how to sequence our healing at the neuroplastic level, we run the risk of doing a lot of work that's kind of disjointed, but doesn't come together and work at the level of the nervous system, at the deep level. So there is a process to this work. It's not linear, and yet we put it out in a linear way in these programs. So again, I'm saying this just directly, no shame in this, just it's important to understand that the next step is to do the practices, whether through me and my programs or through a somatic practitioner. Now, the second piece to this, because there's a question here that relates to this. The reason I took my work online and started doing group online work, and of course my group workshops in person, is that it wasn't enough for me to see a person once a week for an hour or twice a month for an hour, which was how most people had to do it because of finances, or even once a month for an hour. We wouldn't be able to improve our healthy eating and our exercise capacity, our physical health, by only eating one healthy meal a week or one healthy meal a month. I think you could all agree with that. Not if you agree with that. Therefore, the nervous system is no different. And we treat it in a way more like we might treat healing an infection, right? You take a dose of antibiotics and then it's done. This work isn't like that. It's a lifestyle. I've said before in the past in other videos, if you haven't watched my video on how nervous system regulation is like learning a language as an adult, a second language as an adult, it's similar to that. It takes time. So I left my private practice because I saw that people needed self-study. They needed to become true apprentices of their nervous system, of their somatic body. And a lot of the questions I get revolve around this uncertainty and this lack of skill and this really lack of understanding of what's going on at the biochemical, neurological, cellular, survival, autonomic nervous system level. I know that was a long string of words, but the more we understand theoretically what's going on, but then get into the practices, we literally start to become our own medicine. So just wanted to put that little caveat in there because it's important to me to be very clear that there's more to this than education. So there, I wanted to just put that in there. The second thing, if you were following email, you will know that I said that I would speak a little bit around emotions and what they are and the importance of them. And last week I posted something on Instagram that was a very short clip that it said, emotions are neutral by design. It was something around that line of thinking, and that our emotions are neutral. And it's a funny thing to kind of think about. It's like a 180-degree shift, because when we think of emotions, what do you think about? It might be anger, it might be sadness, it might be fear, it might be joy, it could be disgust, it could be deep, deep grief. So these qualities that we feel, and historically in human society, we have labeled them as good or bad, or we've labeled them as that's a real hot, intense one, and that's a calm, cool one. Or happiness is good and sadness is bad, or anger is good when it's coming from a man, and tears and sadness is better when it's coming from a woman. I'm just making these silly rules. I'm telling you these rules that we've labeled onto emotions. But I always go back to the wild and animals. If a mother, let's say lion, has her cubs and there's a predator trying to get them, like say, I don't know, a hyena or something that's hunting, she isn't going to label her fierce, ferocious anger and aggression as bad, or I shouldn't be doing this, or I'm worried about what that hyena is going to think, or she doesn't do that. I can guarantee you. She goes into an automatic quality of behavior driven through survival, driven through protecting her young, to act, to be emotive in the way that a lion would, so that they get the safety on board so their young aren't taken by that hyena. There's no second guessing. When animals are playing and play fighting in the wild, and again, we'll use the big cat analogy because they love to fight and play and roll and do all this. Again, they would be considered happy and joyful and having fun. But again, they're not thinking to themselves, this is better or worse, or they're just doing it. It's part of their natural being, right? So it's important to see and to start to learn that the emotions that come through us, and emotions primarily are sensations. This is an important one because there's a lot of questions today about sensations, emotions, anxiety, fear, terror. But emotions, by the by, they breed from sensation in the body, right? If someone says, I have sadness, they'll feel it in their heart, or fear, they'll feel it in their gut, or throat, or joy, they'll feel it tingling through their face. Right? There's all these ways that we have labeled things as emotions. We've codified them in our brain with words. But if we really learn to track emotion and we become neutral with it, this is where this idea of neutrality comes in. We just start to feel them, notice them, witness them, and experience them as they are, without putting a valence or a label onto them as good, bad, worse, better, to be gotten rid of, to focus on more. They're just happening. Just like the digestive system does what it does. It gurgles, it produces juices. If you get a cut, you'll probably bleed, and then it clots, and then it gets inflamed, and it scabs. We don't call that good or bad. That's just how it is. That's how the body works. The emotions are no different, but because of our human brains and a lot of society, culture, domestication, all these things that we've unfortunately imposed onto humans so that we can have this civilized society. In the process of that, in the process of domesticating ourselves, we've also domesticated our emotions. We're not free to feel and protect and have boundaries the way, say, that lion would in the den with her cubs and the hyenas trying to get them, or the lions that are playing in the sun and having a great time. So very important for me to just sort of put that a pin in it to say, when we get highly skilled and steeped in this nervous system apprenticeship, in working with our sensations and working with our physiology, with our viscera, with our bodies, with everything that comes with our system, we start to see things just as neutral. And yet, if we've been trained to, stop that if we're feeling something, or go to your room if you're angry or sad, or we only want to see you if you're happy and exuberant, or if you're happy and exuberant, stop doing that, you're being too silly, right? All these things that usually parents put upon us because they themselves didn't know how to handle these feelings, these sensations. So this is a big part of this work, and it can be hard to learn this new language when we haven't done this before. And it can be confusing and it can be frustrating because our wires have been so strongly fused into this judgment of emotions, and it's not neutral. And so my theme, if you will, the last few weeks, how can we feel sensation, bodily expression as neutral? Now, of course, there's one sidebar to this. Let's say you did have a big accident, like you cut yourself and you're burned or you're bleeding. Of course, that is not neutral. So this is where as humans, we have to have distinction. We have to differentiate, right? Then we're not just going to let that happen and not treat it. Then we need to say, oh, shoot, this is actually serious. We need to take care of this. We need to abandon it. Maybe we need to go to the hospital, et cetera, right? Those acute things, that's different. Very, very clear. I really have to be clear. Whereas if we're safe in our own home and there hasn't been an accident, we're living our life and we're processing and we're doing this work, and we start to feel sadness, or we start to feel anger, or we start to feel this disgust, or this deep grief or emotional pain, how can we watch those pieces, be with them, and see them as neutral and as our medicine? Next week, I have a new video coming out on the importance of understanding I'll say this again, the immobility response, the freeze response, and why the immobility response gets stuck and we get trapped in frozenness, frozen kind of fear when the fear is intense, right? And so I won't get into that. You can watch that next week. But again, there's all this distinction and learning around the nervous system that is super, super important. And I am very, very much a big stickler for ensuring that my students and all of you understand not just the basics, but the complexities. And when we understand the complexities, it is super important because we have knowledge of all the different varieties and variations in which our system moves through in order to try to heal and release trauma. The way in which each human releases trauma is going to be different and unique. The reason why is because we've all been brought up in different ways. We're not like those lion cubs in the den with Mama Lion, who treats them all pretty much the same, right? Culture, society, religion, unhealed trauma in our parents, it's all going to come down to creating a human that is not, we're not clones. We're all very different, which means that the work, the healing has to become different as well. It can't be a one size fits all thing. So thank you guys for having your comments in here. Just going to have a little more water. Okay. I'm going to get to the questions that were submitted via email first, and then we'll get into the comments if there's time. And also know that I can't answer questions that are related to other people. So if you have a question about, a child or an aunt or a friend, I just can't offer that input. And I can't do consultation-based questions where you're giving me a medical ailment and then I tell you what to do. I have to speak in broader terms and kind of educate on how this relates to the nervous system, how it relates to healing at this neuroplastic level, and maybe also the different types of trauma and how they impact us physiologically. So understand that that is important as well. But at the end of the day, our autonomic nervous system, again, if you haven't learned the basics of that, I have many videos on that. Please understand it, get into it. It touches everything in our body. It goes all over through all of our organs, our cardiovascular system, how we relate and engage to people, to the environment. It connects to everything. So all roads essentially lead to this system. All right, so the first question is from Lindell. And she wants to know, what is the relationship between trauma and body-focused repetitive behaviors? So these are things like picking at skin. A lot of times people will pick at their cuticles, they'll pick at their hair, their scalp. Her wonder is, why does it express in this manner, and why is it so destructive? So it is a mild form of self-harm. It is along the spectrum. Of course, we probably won't completely, like it's again, mild, it's on the mild spectrum of self-harm because we're harming our skin, we're harming our scalp. It isn't probably something that will put us into, a freeze state or kill us, but it is harming our physical structure, our being. And when we do things that are repetitive like this and literally pick at our system, it is a form of, we could say, self-soothing. It's a form of redirecting the focus to something else in order to bring our nervous system down. And we know this through, and this is a more extreme example, but individuals who cut themselves. I was even watching a show last night where a young fellow, it was a fictional show, was put on high levels of medication, and he couldn't feel anything, and he went and he purposely burned his hand on a hot stove just so he could feel again, right? And so if we think of that extreme example, when we have been brought up in an environment where it isn't safe, where let's say there's no control, we have very little control, and we see this also with eating disorders in kids, and of course how that follows us into adult life. If we can't control the chaos in our environment, and or we don't know how to be with the intensity that's internal, again, what I said a little while ago, those emotions, those sensations, our system is quite clever, and it will it can act out something behaviorally to distract from the internal chaos or the external chaos. It's like we could say it's like a nervous tick, right? And we know things like tics and I'm losing track of the word right now, but Tourette's syndrome, that's the real term, the name, but tics, Tourette's, it is the system trying to complete a trauma response, a procedure, a desire to move something, to shift something out of the nervous system, and it can't get completion. It's looking for that, it's looking for that baseline, but it's not getting it, and so it repeats and repeats and repeats. So to me, these are all along a spectrum, Lyndall. And I know through working with my students, and this just came up in our Smart Body, Smart Mind forum, someone had the exact same question. Of course, we gave the same general answer. And one of the members who's been in the work for much longer than this new person said that they used to do this as well. Massive picking of the skin. I can't remember if it was cuticles or scalp, and no more. It's gone. Absolutely healed. And the healing is because it's not so much trying to stop the picking or stop the behavior, but working with the underlying stress physiology that's driving that need to self-soothe or to distract from what's happening internally or externally. So that is why the body looks to do this. It's looking for a way out. It's looking for a way to calm, to soothe, to regulate, but it's not happening because it continues on this loop. So again, very important, again, as I said at the beginning, start doing this work in a more constructive, more focused way, whether through my programs or working with a practitioner. Okay, next question. This is from email again. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this name right, but Becky. So you were a first responder for 35 years. Wow, thank you for your service. And forced to retire in 2018 due to my PTSD. And you say literally no support from my agency. And that's sad to me because I know that this is the case pretty much globally, at least in more Western cultures. I'm also a healer, spending much of my life teaching health and wellness until I crashed and burned in 2015. My nervous system had enough. Yes, this is what we see. We would call this adrenal fatigue burnout. Although I'm doing lots of great work and watching these videos and following my work, I have a tremendous trauma therapist and grief group. So you've got lots of support, so that's wonderful. So you want to know what is important in terms of supporting severe depression and what is my take on medication to take the edge off. So again, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a psychiatrist, and even if I were, I couldn't offer you direct advice on what to do with meds or not to do. But what I do know is that, again, if we bring it back to the lens of the nervous system, when we work at that deeper level, and you do say you have a therapist, but again, if that therapy is more talk-based, as we would call it, more cognitive, even if it's focused on inner child work and working in that level, if it doesn't connect to how our autonomic nervous system and how these structures, I always point to my body, you guys, when I teach, because this is part of the work, is reconnecting to all the spaces from the brainstem to the gut, down to the pelvis, into the insides, the heart, the joints, the diaphragms, the movement, right? This is part of the nervous system work that we work with and teach. And if we're not getting into those deeper elements, as a first responder and as someone, as you said, who's just living life and then got burned out, these spaces and places are holding typically immense survival stress and are also probably, as you said, severely shut down. This is what depression is. It's the system, again, on that spectrum. It no longer can fight and flee. It's in that shutdown freeze state. It's given up. There's no more juice in the engine, so to speak. And so to resolve and to heal and to bring back more life force energy, we need to work at these survival stress levels, and specifically working at the level, we call this in my work, the kidney adrenal level. I did a video on this last fall. Crystal can pop it up. But this is the work that I've learned and I practice and I teach my students, work of Kathy Kane, where it's literally working with the kidneys and the adrenals. These are two all organs are important, aren't they? But they are very important in the stress response to threat and perceived threat. And they will stay fatigued and bogged down and exhausted, even if we're doing good cognitive work and good emotional work. If we're not directly going, from my experience at least, to that level, they won't fully recover. Diet can do a little bit. Rest can definitely do a lot. However, many of my students will say, I am so amazing at my diet. I'm always sleeping, and yet I can't get myself going. This to me is a sign that there is deeper traumatic stress held in the entire nervous system. And because the adrenals are what pumps out adrenaline and cortisol, and as a first responder, that will have been so normal for you. it gets pumped out to the point where it can't pump out anymore. And then this is where we crash. So very important to start the work at the nervous system level. Becky, I've got a few more resources that I'll guide you to. One is a webinar I did on adrenal fatigue. It's quite old. I'm a little younger at the time, but it is a solid webinar that talks about what adrenal fatigue is at a deeper level, what it means, the processes, the stages of adrenal burnout, and then of course, the steps to take to start to heal. In my programs, the work that is more focused around working with the stress organs is my longer program, Smart Body, Smart Mind. However, we don't run that until next spring, early spring, late winter. So if you haven't yet started the 21-day nervous system tune-up, do that, because that'll get you prepared for that next step. You can also do this work, again, one-on-one with a practitioner. Of course, right now, we know that we can't do that. And it is difficult to find someone who can work at this deeper level, because there's only I would say maybe 1,000 or so people who I would say have trained at the deep, not even, I'm being very generous there. There's probably only hundreds of us in the world who are trained at the somatic experiencing and the level that Kathy Kane teaches, where I get into, or where we would get into working with these stress organs. So, you can do this work, keep it up, but know that that next step, in my opinion, has to be followed so that you can get under the belly of all that intense horror and terror and exhaustion from being a first responder. If you haven't seen my latest video on working with horror and disgust, that will be perfect for you, because it gives you just that knowledge that when you were a first responder, if you did not work with those intense images that you saw and that you felt and you needed to process in the moment or very shortly after, this is why first responders end up with PTSD and complex PTSD. You throw in early trauma and developmental trauma into a first responder and they never get that out. You have a recipe for, as you said, severe depression. It's not, and it's important to understand. So this goes back to the medication thing. To me, this isn't a disease, depression. It is a response to a nervous system that is struggling to hold all of the traumatic experiences that it has seen and witnessed and it hasn't processed. If you haven't yet, again, I know these are a lot of extra resources, but my 3-part healing trauma series, it's called Healing Trauma. The first video, all the videos are important, but that first video is so important because it talks about the swimming pool and beach ball analogy. If you are following me here and you haven't watched that video yet, please watch that video, because it teaches you how our capacity to process gets shut down and why we need to grow capacity to remove the stressors in our system. This is why, again, classic talk therapy, more emotional processing, it doesn't cut it. It needs to get into all those survival responses that got trapped in all those places and spaces when we saw things and we didn't get the expression out, the screams, the disgust, all of that. Also understand that you don't need to process every single event that ever occurred in your life as a first responder. They will clump together. And as you process maybe one that was intense and really specific, it loosens up the ties on other ones. So keep up with the good work. And as I said, if you can, go that next step and check out some more of the resources. Okay. Just let me have some water, you guys, here. Ivana had a question. So you recently stayed, this is from the chat box that I'm looking at. You recently stayed in lockdown with a friend of mine who could not return to Argentina. Yep, because of coronavirus, because of COVID-19, I should say. It was awful. She had certain narcissistic traits, and I noticed huge neglectful attitudes towards her children. Her oldest kid is very hyperactive and aggressive, and their little baby seems a bit delayed in her development. Please, how can one reverse this? Is this manageable? So it definitely can be reversed, Ivana, but these aren't your kids. It doesn't look like. She's a friend of yours, and so it's up to her. I know that might be a harsh response, but that person, that mother, has to have interest. And so again, you have to maybe tell her about this work. And if she has no interest, then you have to leave it. I have found in this line of work and in a lot of things that are highly important in our world, we can't force someone, you know, that classic saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You certainly can't make a horse drink. They have to want to drink. They have to be thirsty. They have to know that that's what they want. So yes, this can be healed when a kid has hyperactivity and if a child is delayed, but it has to be the parent, because if the parent is the one with that child, calling the shots, disciplining them, setting boundaries, teaching them about life, if that mother or father isn't aligned with what's going on, it's almost, it's going to sound terrible, but it's almost a lost cause. This was one reason why I stopped working with kids where the parents weren't also doing the work, right? There were times where I'd have parents just drop their kids off at the office and be like, can you fix them? I'm like, well, this child is usually not like that just because they were born that way, right? It happens due to something in utero, something at birth. It could be due to parental unawareness. It doesn't necessarily mean that the parents don't want to treat them well, but they just might not have their own internal knowledge of how to treat themselves well, and then that expresses to the child. So it's tough to see, Ivana. I guarantee you it's tough to see. I see it all the time. And you'll have to decide what battles you want to fight and try to win. And it all comes down to the mother. But yes, it can definitely be reversed. It can be healed, especially at that level. But she has to be the one to switch the switch and make that decision to do so. Okay. Naomi, I see your question there. I do not know what EUBD is. I think that might be borderline personality disorder. I don't know what EU is. This is something that, again, it comes back down to understanding why the system has gotten to that point. And from what we know in the diagnostic manual, the DSM that diagnoses psychiatric illnesses and disorders, most, if not all, and my mentors out in the field who are older than me, who have written books on this, especially if I think about Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, all of these pieces are tied to early trauma, to developmental trauma, to unsafety in the environment. So I believe we all have the capacity to heal, and we have to do the right work in the right sequences. So again, this comes back to where you are at, what support systems you have, access to a really strong, solid somatic experiencing practitioner, someone who's trained at the body-based level, starting with my programs, getting the basics of learning about the nervous system. It all, again, emotional regulation, you say in regards to emotional regulation, emotions are there, and how we relate to them is what makes them regulate or not. And if we've been living in a certain way where we're constantly bombarding ourselves, we're feeling emotions, we're feeling sensations, and we're either shutting them down or we're going into more intense activation, our system is going to be very wired to that way of living. And so part of this process, Naomi, is rewiring and literally shifting the system to a different track. I use the example of like a railroad track. Like we've been on this track for so long, and if we want to change the track, it isn't as easy as just popping the train over into the new track. We've got to build the new track. We've got to do all the work. We got to put the train there. We have to teach the conductor. It's a process. So again, it comes back to, people often ask, will this ever heal? And I will say it depends on you, the person. It depends on your desire to heal, your deservingness to heal, letting, in some ways, the old stuff not go, but making peace with it and deciding to move forward. Anyone who stays in what we would call victim identification usually has a hard time healing. And that comes not just from me, that comes from one of my mentors, Peter Levine. He will say that over and over again when he works with folks who have severe trauma histories and severe diagnoses. And he knows when someone is going to be better when they don't identify with their past trauma. They identify with themselves, and I'm going to heal myself, and I'm going to do everything I can because I want this kind of a life. I don't want that kind of a life anymore. So that really relates to all of us, really. I mean, we're all on different spectrums of our early traumas, our past traumas, our shock traumas, our transgenerational traumas. We all have it. No one has gotten out of humanity without some form of traumatic stress or lots. And so for everyone here, it so means moving forward and just deciding, I'm going to take this into my own hands and figure it out. So the general answer is yes, and it comes down to all these other pieces. Marette asks, I'm interested in the link between our menstrual cycle and healing trauma. Any books that you can recommend? I don't have any off the top of my head because, again, and this is where my broken record starts to pop in, the menstrual cycle, the reproductive system, as is the digestion, the immune, the cardiovascular, the lymph, the central nervous system, how we respond to stress, our endocrine system, which again is hormonal, linked to our menstrual cycle. All of it is connected to this autonomic nervous system. And again, if we are stuck in a loop of intense survival stress, and let's say there's no flow in the system because we're so shut down, this goes back to the question that Becky asked about deep depression and being adrenally fatigued and burnt out. If we're living in that kind of state, not just our menstruation and all the organs there, but everything is impacted. And so Peter, again, I'll quote him, has often clumped severe menstrual disturbances like severe premenstrual syndrome and pain during menstruation. He would term that a reproductive migraine, where basically the tissue, the soft tissue, or I should say the smooth muscle tissue of those organs, it isn't working well. The circulation is limited. It's sluggish. It's not got that alive quality. And when that occurs, that whole cycle is like, it's just not turning the way it should. And then that's where we get intense pain. That's where hormones can be thrown off. So it comes back down to the basics. And this is the same with our digestion, with our immune system, with how our heart pumps and moves blood to all of our bodies. So nothing specific. You could research it to see, but at the end of the day, again, I've seen my students, I've seen myself, I've seen my colleagues will say hands down, as they become more regulated in their autonomic nervous system, their reproductive cycles improve immensely. And we start to tune into them differently, which also helps them. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of input there. This is definitely being recorded, this live stream, and then we put it up onto YouTube afterwards. Deedham asks, I love, Irene, that you're always honest. Well, if I'm not honest, I'll get sick. Right, guys? Like if we know truth and we're not speaking it, this is what causes us to be unwell. Back to the menstrual thing, it connects. If we're not in flow, if we're not speaking our truth, if we're not authentic to what we know, it comes back to like that little kid who is exuberant or is sad, and the mother or the father or the teacher says, you know, stop being that way, or come on, be happier. You know, you can't be sad, right? So we get these things locked into us so young. And if we look at some of the work that, say, Gabor Mate has done, his book, just Google him and stress and disease. The book, When the Body Says No, is an amazing book. He will say hands down, when he was working with people in hospital under palliative care, he was head of palliative care at Vancouver General Hospital here just up the street from my house. Those who were dying of severe chronic autoimmune conditions, MS, ALS, lupus, cancers, rheumatoid arthritis, all of them have the similar story. They didn't do anything for themselves. They never expressed their emotions. They did everything for everyone else, and they dismissed their own aliveness, their own deservingness to be a human with a voice and a force. And I thought that that was, a very poignant way to see our health. So yes, of course, I'm going to be honest. I would be an absolute hypocrite if I wasn't. So yes, I encourage all of us to be honest and also realize that it takes time. If we were not raised being allowed to express who we are, or we were in a job environment where we had to shut our mouths and not speak up, however you want to say, I mean, this is a perfect time right now in our history of humanity with everything going on with lockdowns and et cetera. And the doctor is telling us that this is actually not as intense as we think it is, and yet we're being told these things. People are confused. The people who are healthy and really vibrant, from what I've seen, are listening to their own gut. They're listening to their own soul. They're not listening to everything that's being fed to them. So that drives, it's not just in health, it's in how we relate to society and what people tell us, we should be thinking and doing. So be really careful and aware in this current time of how we are treating ourselves and our thoughts and what we're believing. Really important. Elsa says, I've heard how borderline personality could be complex trauma. 100%. 100%. I have not met anyone who would be classified in that world who hasn't had some form of trauma history. And often I'll say it's not the kind of traumas that we think of, like big accidents and war and severe neglect. It's often individuals who were brought up in very affluent society homes where they had everything they needed, but the misattunement from the mom or dad, the rules, the ridiculousness of protocol and routine and pushing, all of it just didn't nurture that little nervous system. And then that little nervous system literally doesn't know how to have a personality. If anything, their personality is all them and they're not in their own individual juice, right? Like, we form personality in human society to basically stay alive and cope. And so if we had an environment that was stressful, adverse, that didn't allow us to be who we were, we would have to change who we are naturally to suit the conditions, so we don't get hurt, so that we don't get hit, so that we get fed, right? Think about all these kids in situations where they're saying you can't have that unless you do this, right? I mean, there's a million examples. But yes, that's complex trauma, and it's super hard to pinpoint because it's not like, usually a person can't say, oh yeah, I remember when we had that car accident, or yeah, that's when my house burned down and we all were destitute. Usually it's these micro traumas that are so elusive, and you don't even realize that they're not right, because that's just how the essence of the whole home always was, and it creates confusion, right? So keep doing this work, you guys. Just keep learning. I'm going to get to another question from email. This is from Oz. So the last 4 years, I occasionally wake up with my arms crossed over my face, feeling stressed, and I can't breathe, and I have to move my arms thinking, how did they get there? I have periods of sleep paralysis, like I'm almost falling asleep, but I stop myself doing it feeling alarmed, as if I fall asleep, something dangerous will happen. I periodically struggle with my life. So you realize that you probably have early childhood trauma, as well as separation traumas later in years. I also suspect to have some sort of adult separation anxiety, which started after my child's birth. I don't get clingy. I just feel symptoms like having anxiety around my partner's plane crashing when he flies abroad, or having difficulty sleeping the first night. So this again is a very classic, I hinted to this earlier, when we are brought up with some form of situation around us that isn't safe, and it could again be due to the family system not being safe. It could be in cases of sleep paralysis. It's often highly connected, not always, but I'll mention it, to medical trauma, being born premature, being put in an incubator, being poked and prodded. It could be a surgery that occurred when we were really young. It could be a dental surgery or a dental procedure where we're being strapped down. Anything where we are being acted upon against our will, even if it's for our health, like a dental procedure or, say, a surgery that saves our life. But as a little tiny infant, we won't know what is happening. It's just all bad. That makes sense? It's all scary. It's all somatic. If you go back to what I said at the very beginning of this chat about emotions and them being somatic, this is where we feel these anxieties. And when this waking up in the middle of the night, and it isn't just, it could be hands over the face, it could be holding our fists really strong, clenching, walking in the sleep. I mean, there's all these things that we do unconsciously when we sleep to try to process the old somatic symptoms in our system as a result of these old traumas. The piece about the plane crashing, this is common in folks who have had early trauma. My husband was like that, still has a little bit of that. He, again, born premature, complex trauma, complex PTSD, a lot of early abuse, family wasn't safe, et cetera, et cetera. When I fly, it's the same thing. And it's because when we are brought up in an environment that is that unsafe, and maybe we were poked and prodded at when we were infants and kids, we literally think that the world is a dangerous place, that we're all going to die, and that no one is to be trusted and to be suspicious of everything. So there's an important theme there that'll come into some of the other questions. But my advice to all of us, to all of you who have any bits of this, and it's more common than we realize, and often this stuff starts to pop up at night because we are going into a more unconscious state, and the sympathetic energies are allowed to come up. This is what anxiety is. The protection, that is the system trying to protect, trying to complete old traumatic responses that didn't get to fully respond and complete. So what we do with these is we do the work. Again, we work with the nervous system. We teach people the deeper elements of this. And we go through the process, as I said at the beginning, of sequencing the neuroplastic healing, starting with the basics, starting with that example that I gave of the swimming pool and beach balls, growing capacity in the nervous system so that we have more space. And then these things that occur, as I said at the beginning, keeping them neutral. So again, this takes practice, but if we're not used to sensing something like anxiety, terror, or panic, or even horror, which was the topic of this week's new video, if we're not used to sensing these things and being neutral with them, and we fear them more or we turn away from them, they get stuck in our system. So a grand scale piece of this work is building up the capacity, the higher brain knowledge, the connection to the environment, so that we know where we are in the present moment, to be with these intensities in a way that allows us to process what is coming up and out of the body without fearing it and without pushing it away, because it won't just heal on its own. That is the most important thing. Not the most, but one of the most important things is to know that this doesn't just heal with time. The nervous system is so complex, and it isn't like that cut that you might get where it just heals on its own. It's not like digestion that just happens naturally. I have found, because of our complex brain as humans, that this stuff, it doesn't just go away because of the complexities, because of the fact that we've got culture and society and repression and we don't know how to always be honest with what we're feeling because we've been trained to not feel it and to not really listen to it. Great. Okay. Gonna do another question here. So there's a question from Wendy. And Wendy, your question really falls into the few things that I've been saying. And it has to do with performance anxiety. And you have a bit of history here around university and not showing up for exams and opening up tasks and having panic and shutdown. And again, this comes back to where did that start? How did that start? Again, was there intense stress put on the system? Was there expectations? Was there something that occurred event-wise in a moment when you were younger or older, I'm not sure, that sparked your system to panic and be afraid of such things? And here's the thing, it might not. This could go back old to early infancy. It could be something that, again, in utero, it could be transgenerational. We know that that is real. We know that past life trauma is real. And so it comes back down again to, your question is how to work with this. And you've said that my articles and videos have been your daily vitamins. I love that analogy. So I would say that's awesome. Keep up with the daily vitamins, but now it's time to really shift the way in which you eat, so to speak. In other words, can you start to do this work? Can you start to learn about how to be with your body when it's not going into these moments? So again, as humans, we tend to focus on something when it's severe and gone all bad, right? It's just the way it works. And we need to kind of work with ourselves in moments when we're not in panic, when we're not in fear. Because if we only focus on our body when we are in a state of stress, we only then know how to focus on our body when we're in a state of stress, and all other times we're just disconnected with it. And this is why we have panic. This is why we have these things that pop up that throw us off so much, because we haven't trained and apprenticed to be with our system in all shapes and colors, in all forms. So one of the things I'll often say to my students is it possible to start paying attention to the body and work with the body? And whether that's through one of my programs or through working with a somatic practitioner one-on-one, to focus on things in the body when things are better, so that you build capacity, so that when these things do come up, you can track and trace what's happening. But it really comes back down to what I said in this previous question, that this intense fear, somewhere along the lines, your system was given the message that the world is a dangerous place. No one is to be trusted, not even myself, right? Because you mentioned this has to do with your own performance, doing your own work. So something in there, I know this is a little gray, but that general field and feeling of the world is a dangerous place. No one can be trusted. I can't be trusted. And if I do this, something bad is going to happen. That, again, is a very strong script within the nervous system physiology, and it's body-based. And again, to work with that nervous system physiology, because it touches everything in the body, we got to work at getting into the body, into the somatic system, and growing capacity. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of input there. So keep doing the work, and if you can, start with one of the programs or find a somatic practitioner to work with. Okay. I'm going to answer a question that came through the Facebook page, just because it's a little different, and then we'll wrap up here. And just again, to note that it's super important to see how the nervous system, it's called the autonomic nervous system. When I say nervous system, that's what I mean. And it's part of our peripheral nervous system, meaning it comes out from the spinal cord and it touches everything. And so the common themes that revolve in our discussions here are around specific ailments, et cetera, specific syndromes, psychiatric illnesses, depression, anxiety, fear, panic, adrenal fatigue. And we're seeing more and more, and the research is backing this up, especially the adverse childhood experiences study, that when we have had dysregulation in our system, when the autonomic nervous system is pumping for life, fleeing and fighting, and then it's shutting down because it can't handle what it's feeling inside and what it senses is dangerous outside, it puts us into a survival loop that never ends. And depending on our histories, genetically, depending on our predispositions, because we all have slightly different predispositions for different ailments, will express that. And so it's important, and this comes into the next question about epigenetics. I've seen through the work that I've done for many years, when we start to work at this level, there isn't usually this magic bullet, like quick fix, like you take a hit of really strong antibiotics and the infection is gone. Doesn't usually happen that way. We start to see little shifts. And usually, not always, but usually it's the behavior that is one of the last things to change, because behavior is driven by the biology. So when we get into this work, we'll start to see, people will say, wow, my digestion's better. I'm actually, my poops are better. Or, wow, I actually was able to go for a walk and really enjoy the birds. Or, wow, I was able to listen to my child and I found my body wasn't going into a survival stress. Or I was actually able to sleep tonight, because I know there was a question on sleep, but I didn't get to, but I was able to sleep better and easier. And so again, questions around sleep, questions around digestion, questions around panic. Again, if our system is living in this fight, flight, freeze, the world is a dangerous place, and we have unprocessed old traumatic stress in our body, things like sleep, things like digestion, our immune system, it's not going to work well. And so when we work at improving the capacity of the somatic system from this nervous system lens, very important, because just doing, let's say, exercise or just going to a walk, yeah, that works our body, right? Doing yoga, it works our body. Even doing mindfulness, meditation, it's working with our mind-body connection, because I know there were some questions about mindfulness and meditation. But again, if we don't add in these next level layers of what the nervous system is and actually working with the physical structures of the body, and then most importantly, listen up, how this connects with our environment and how we take the environment in, we're missing a very big piece of this puzzle. And so again, many questions revolve around specifics, but we have to turn our view of the body and the healing system 180 degrees, because we've been taught and we've been programmed through the medical system typically that there's X problem, therefore we give it Y solution. This happens, we do this to it. And this is different. It's really different. And I hope you're starting to feel the difference of this. It's a lifestyle change, really. So Elisa, your question was in the Facebook page, here on the Facebook page. You said, I'm fascinated about epigenetics and neuroplasticity. Would love to know how the nervous system could help in bipolar disease. So I've already kind of touched on these psychiatric illnesses. And again, all of these things that we have labeled as psychiatric illness, like bipolar, et cetera. Someone just said borderline, ADD, multiple personality, which is now DID. I mean, there's a whole list. We know and we've seen that they are mostly all connected to something bad and scary that occurred that never stopped and never got resolved. And then the system finds a way to cope with that. It finds a way to survive amongst the chaos internally. And so some, it might become more psychiatric, others it might become more somatic, like fibromyalgia, like chronic pain, like MS, like cancer, like heart disease, like insomnia, like horrible relationship patterns, addiction, right? It all kind of, it seems like this is the one thing. It's not the only thing. We still need to eat well and have good relationships and have clean air and all these things and be active. And if this other piece isn't put in there, we miss a big portion of the healing. So epigenetics, I said a little bit about this already, but epigenetics is this new field. It's not very new, newer field of study that our DNA, our genetics express based on the environment and based on how we treat our bodies. So we all have genetic markers for various things, predispositions, and we know through, again, research and through just life and epidemiology that not everyone who has a genetic marker for a certain disease will get that thing. And then there's people who will get certain cancers and diseases and they don't have genetic markers. And so we look at this and we go, well, why is that occurring? And, neuroplasticity is a neutral word because neuroplasticity is also why we have addiction, right? The wires have become so tightly wound in one direction. So we've got this neuroplasticity that creates that kind of behavior. Whereas neuroplasticity also means that we can change that behavior and that way of being to something else with time. One thing I'll maybe end with, and Gabor Mate, I've quoted him a lot, and I quoted him earlier. He said, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase, but he would often say that trying to study cancer by studying the cell, like the cells in the body, is like trying to figure out a traffic jam, so like a traffic jam on a highway, by studying the internal combustion engine of a car, right? So again, studying cancer by looking just at the cell is like studying and trying to solve a traffic jam by looking at the engine of a car. So the engine is important for the car, but that isn't causing the traffic jam. And so again, we get really hooked up on nitty-gritty science and cellular physiology, which is important by all means. There are some diseases and some like genetic things like blood disorders, for example, that are really at that cellular level. But when we look at these broader scale syndromes, as we would call them in my work, these clusters of symptoms like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, psychiatric illnesses, etc., they're not just isolated because the brain tissue is sick or because the muscle tissue is sick. There's something in the system that is being driven to survive. It isn't thriving, and it's being dampened down by this survival response that's constantly looking for threat. And so we need to not only turn that threat off, but we have to reteach the body how to be with itself, how to open up itself so that it can heal again. And again, it's not a quick fix. It takes time. And Lizette asks about adrenal fatigue. I've been told that if your adrenals are totally burned out, there's nothing to do. That is absolutely false. I'm not sure who told you that. If we don't do the right things, then it might not help. But the adrenal glands, just like brain tissue, nerve tissue, can regenerate. But again, and if you haven't, Lizette, started with looking at some of my resources, there's one specifically, I mentioned an adrenal fatigue webinar. But the ebook I have called The 5 Stages of Neuroplastic Healing, 5 Stages of Neuroplastic Healing, it talks about the need to sequence our healing. So if someone isn't sequencing their healing, if someone's, say, going right into meditation practice, but they're not learning how to stay connected to their body and their physiology, that's not going to help the adrenal fatigue. There needs to be this sequence. Just like learning a language, I couldn't just start talking German to you right now because I wanted to. It would be impossible. I'd have to learn the basics, the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3s, and then I'd have to start to learn how to put sentences together and listen and the weird pronunciation that my throat isn't used to doing. It's the same with learning to heal things like adrenal fatigue, chronic illness, etc., is we need to learn how to sequence the healing. This is very new, right? This is new as of just the last sort of 10 years. And it was all kind of more theoretical and being taught in, kind of more private practice, and doctors, et cetera, would see this who work with, say, chronic pain. But we know that this can be healed. I've seen my clients heal from severe fibromyalgia, to the point where their blood chemistries are changing, inflammatory markers are changing, their energy is back, they're exercising again, they're in relationships, and they've gone through the process of working in this more methodical way of bringing more general life and capacity and knowledge back to the system. So yeah. And you said it was a therapist and a neuropsychologist that said that. So, again, I don't poo-poo them. They just haven't been trained. We have to remember that what I am talking about here is not it's not that it's unnormal, it's new, right? So I was fortunate to study some very highly sophisticated forms of neuroplastic healing, namely the Feldenkrais method, working and studying through Peter Levine and somatic experiencing, and then the work of Kathy Kane, which is called somatic practice. And then I put them all together, right? I've put them all together, plus with an open mind and doing the work in the field. It hasn't yet come out to the mainstream. We're working on that. That's what we're doing here, but it's going to take time. So it's not the fault of the doctors and the therapists. It's just that their schooling happened. And if they're not out actively searching for this next piece, because it isn't science necessarily, because it's not a study, it's out in the field practical work that people are doing. So it's very different. So, I'm not surprised that it was a therapist or a doctor that would have said that you can't heal adrenal fatigue, because most people haven't been taught how that can happen, right? We're verging on not just working with the three-dimensional body when we work with adrenal fatigue. We're working more four-dimensional. We're even getting into a bit of the fifth. We're working with energy. We're working with intention. We're working with visualization, but we're also working with the structures. So we're blending it all together, and that's why I think it's different. So I am going to sign off. Hello to those of you that are popping on right now. Obviously, this is recorded. We're on the 7th of May right now, 2020. Again, thank you if you're here live. Thank you if you're watching the recording. We'll do another one of these in a few weeks. Again, if you haven't yet started one of the programs that I offer right now, the one that you can start at self-study is the 21-day nervous system tune-up. It is the beginning stages to learning the language of the nervous system, getting into the physical practices. And the practices are more than just orienting. I know a lot of you have been around me and you see me teaching this concept of orienting and looking and seeing. That is like the A of the ABC 1, 2, 3 in the whole alphabet. It's the first step, but it's not the only step. So please know, because I know there was a question about orienting, that this is more than orienting to the present moment. It's much more complex. It can't be done in one session or one lesson. This is a lifestyle shift, and it works when we really decide to study it. So definitely feel into this. Go with your truth, what you want to do with your health, with your healing. I'm pretty certain that, and I said this yesterday on a social media feed, that human resilience and nervous system regulation is going to be the new currency. I really think that's true, because we don't know what's going to happen with our future. And if we have regulation in our system and safety internally, then it's okay not knowing. When we don't have that regulation and that resiliency, that's what throws us into more fear. That's what throws us into more panic, more this ability to not be with our system and work with it can be terrifying when things are out of control in our environment. If we grew up in an out of control environment, this time might feel really scary for a lot of folks. But the more we regulate and the more we work with ourselves, the uncertainty becomes less scary. And if anything, it doesn't even bother us. And I'm seeing that with many of my students right now, is they're just taking things one day at a time, working with themselves, being true to themselves, and using their own body as their medicine. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to end this. Again, this is recorded. Again, drop-in class is not this Saturday, but the next Saturday. And if all else fails, everything is on my site. It's just my name, irenelyon.com. We will see you next time. Bye for now.